My name is Sandy Edwards. I am an independent curator of photography. I have a long association with Stills Gallery, which is probably the prime photographic gallery in Australia. And I also run a business called Art There, which provides services for photographers to have exhibitions mainly in Sydney, but beyond as well. I have been looking at photography in Australia for a long time, and over the years I became very familiar with some of the photographers in this exhibition, and when they were thinking of doing a 10-year anniversary of their exhibition, of their work practice, they came to me and they discussed the idea of me curating the exhibition. And that's how it started, and it took about 2 years to create. It also took a long time to get funding for the exhibition because it's very hard to get independent funding for exhibitions of photography in Australia. And we finally got the go-ahead when Manly Gallery in Sydney decided they would like to take the show as the first starting point. And without Manly Gallery, we could not have got some of the funding that we got, because as an independent curator, I am not a not-for-profit organisation, and Manly did all the infrastructure and provided the backing for us to actually make it a reality. Oculi is a gathering together of photographers. They call themselves a collective. Dean Sewell says they are a movement. They did not want to be called an agency because an agency is associated with commerciality, and they were intending to, in a sense, be more than just, and they are the word, I'm using the just pejoratively, newspaper photographers, as most of them are still working for Fairfax or for Murdoch corporations as newspaper photographers, as photojournalists. I wanted to bring out individuality as well as the group consciousness, the group style, the group intentions, and the breadth and significance historically of this work. There has always been a huge division in Australian photography in terms of photographers who are working commercially and photographers who are working as artists. And one of the intentions of Oculi was to bridge this gap. They did not want to be pigeonholed purely as newspaper photographers. They saw themselves, and they were much more than that. They all had personal projects running outside of their work prescriptions, and they wanted to be known as more than the images that were seen on the daily newspapers. We have to look historically, and we have to look at what was before this new generation of photographers emerged. And if you look at the very well-known Australian photographers historically, somebody such as David Moore or Max Dupain, there was a very particular style that showed mainly in black and white, a fairly formal, a fairly, everything was very well exposed, everything was very sharp, everything was very visible in the photographs. And those photographers are very, very well-known Australian photographers. This group, in a sense, want to break from tradition without leaving it behind. You can still see some of the tradition coming through in the photographs. However, you can still also see a marked difference in their stylistic approach. Well, I think they must have, because I could always recognise a Tamara Dean image if I saw it in the Sydney Morning Herald. She had a particular way of using light, and it was a very pleasing photograph. It was more than just a photograph of somebody who was in the news. It had more going for it. So, and I think all of these photographers, once you get to know their style, and once you, I guess it happens subliminally, we get used to this style, and it has definitely, in a sense, colour is much more vivid in newspapers, and they, you know, even though they use black and white, their distinctive style is colour, and that was just a historical change. And the other thing is digital, the impact of digital, because these photographers choose to use digital for their newspaper work, but they often choose to shoot film for their non-newspaper work. I think we have to look at terms. The terms that need to be looked at are news photography, which is one thing, photojournalism, which is another thing, and documentary photography, which is another thing again. Now, that doesn't mean they don't overlap, but I think it's important to understand that usually documentary photography means that it's more than just a newspaper photograph. It's actually a project that a photographer's working on, and they're trying to tell a story, and usually by more than one image. Photojournalism is usually attached most definitely to world events, news events, and photojournalists might do an essay or a series. However, it's about something that is happening in the world, something like, you know, a war story or a disaster or something that's actually happening that they have gone to cover. A documentary photographer often does more personal subject matters, such as telling the story about somebody with a disability and how life is for that person. They're more subtle, they're more able to take those pictures over a longer period of time and not actually work for a deadline. Because they're trying to tell both an individual story and a more general story. I think their ambitions are very high. They're not just your average chronicler or snapper. They are truly trying to leave a legacy of images which say something about what it is like to be in Australia at this point in time. And they want those images to be striking, they want them to be bold, and they want them to be very true. They don't want them to be pretty pictures. They want them to tell things as they are in some way. But they also believe that a photograph is quite different from words, and a photograph can tell a story in some ways a much more powerful way even than words. But let's just not be competitive, but just in a very different way from a journalist who's writing. These photographers want to tell whatever they see to be the truth of what it is like to be living in Australia at this point in time. And that means they're not going to shy away from things that are difficult. They're actually going to move towards them. That doesn't mean that some things may not be happy and vital and heartwarming. However, they're not going to favour those images intentionally. There are so many choices that a photographer has to make, but these photographers want to leave something poetic and powerful and memorable about Australia now. And when I was reading the words of what they say about how they want to create beauty, show beauty within struggle, that made me really think that just even in the last 4 years, in which we've had a very difficult time in Australia economically and environmentally, that those words are very well chosen, because they're trying to bring beauty together with struggle, and they're saying these things are not separate, they actually sit together. Because they have to work for newspapers and they have to cover events as they happen, I am absolutely positive that this makes them look at things that the rest of us, the general population, don't actually have to look at. We can choose whether to look at things or not. Whereas as photographers, if suddenly there is a tsunami in Aceh and you're asked to go there, you go there and you try to get the best possible photograph you can get. If there is a flood in Brisbane, you go there and you're out there toughing it out, even after the journalist is back trying to write the story. You're still trying to get the image that most powerfully represents exactly how it felt to be in that flood and affected by that flood. So I think that's a really important distinction from, say, an art photographer who might be working with a very different methodology and a very different way of working. It's always been, as I said earlier, very difficult for photographers to be both working photographers and artists. And it's partly just a time constraint and a force of where you have to put your attention, but it's also something that any photographer who wants to be an artist has to understand, that to be an artist there is a different agenda from being, fulfilling someone's commercial brief. That in fact an artist and a contemporary artist in the photographic side of things is often starting from an idea, and the idea has come from the artist themselves. Whereas a photographer must then learn to work in that way, and photographic practices in contemporary art photography are very varied and very different from documentary, and in fact documentary was forced off the walls of art galleries for quite some time in Australia for various historical reasons. But art photographers often construct their own images. They might do them in a studio. They might combine images digitally. They might manipulate images digitally much, much more than a documentary or a photojournalist photographer would do, because they would believe that they did not want to alter the truth too much, the truth as they saw it. Now, both artists are working with truth, but they're actually coming at it from very, very different angles. So I always say to photographers, if you want to be an artist, you must study what people are doing in art, and you must actually make a conscious decision to be an artist, and that means you may run your life differently. Both a broader view of the world and what exists in the world, but very much what you will learn from Oculi photographers is to be bold in your visual style, to be adventurous, to take risks on many different levels, to come close to your subject matter, to not stand back. You actually need to engage with it, and to be prepared to really learn about how a photograph works, both in terms of exposure, colour, saturation, content, composition, and also to try and define what it is that attracts you about photography. What subject matter? Photography is just a template. Any subject matter can be approached through photography. So a lot of these photographers are choosing these subjects because they are very interested in them for some personal reason. And so all photography must come from a subjective place as well as an objective place. And so it's very important to work out what it is that interests you and to move towards that.